So while the government's response to the crisis has been in many ways almost identical to the response to the Asia crisis, the structure of the Chinese economy has changed in very important ways over the intervening 10 years. In particular, the share of net exports and investment to nominal GDP has risen significantly, while the share of consumption has fallen from above 60% at the end of the 90s to below 50% today. So this change in the structure of the Chinese economy means that if there were to be a rerun of the 1999 growth rates for these three expenditure components, the result would be much lower nominal GDP growth. 1999 was the trough year for Chinese GDP growth following the Asia crisis. In that year, nominal GDP growth as calculated by the expenditure method rose 5.1%, while real GDP was higher at 7.8%. Real GDP was higher in that year due to a combination of deflation and the statistical discrepancy between the expenditure method and the production method used in calculating China's real GDP. Here, consumption and investment include government consumption and government investment. So these 7.8% and 5.2% growth rates for those two components capture the 1 to 2 percentage points that the fiscal stimulus is believed to have added to Chinese GDP growth in 1999. 1 to 2 percentage points is also what the current fiscal stimulus is expected to add to GDP growth this year and next. Of course, the striking thing about the 1999 data is the 34.5% drop in net exports. This had a relatively small effect on GDP growth in that year because the share of net exports was still relatively small. Now that the share of net exports has doubled, a decline in net exports of this magnitude will be twice as big a drag on GDP growth. And this is the main reason, along with the increase in the share of investment, why if we were to have the same growth rates for these expenditure components as we had in 1999, that nominal GDP growth would be only 3%. And I think this time the trough growth rates for these three expenditure components are unlikely to be higher, which means that the trough nominal GDP growth, whenever that trough year occurs, would be no higher than 3%. To start with the net exports component, it's often said that net exports is not as important to Chinese GDP growth as is commonly imagined because its share in the total is so small. But I think what this analysis misses is that net exports is also the most volatile component of expenditure. You can see that over the last 10 years, net export growth has ranged from the minus 34.5% of 1999 to 150% in 2005. And this year, the outlook for world trade is certainly much worse than it was in 1999, when the US and EU countries were not in recession. In 1999, world trade grew 4.6%, even with the Asian countries still recovering from the Asia crisis and the Russian ruble crisis of 1998. But this year, the WTO expects world trade to fall by 9%, which would be the biggest contraction in world trade since the end of World War II. With this as the backdrop, it's hard to see how the trough growth rate for Chinese net exports is going to be any higher than it was in the actually much more, from a world trade perspective, much more benign year of 1999. In the case of investment, it's important to realize that in China, investment has followed a pronounced boom and bust cycle ever since the end of the Civil War in 1949. Perhaps the most well-known example of one of these earlier Chinese investment booms was the 1958 Great Leap Forward, when the Chinese government briefly attempted to overtake the UK and catch up with the US in steel production using small backyard steel furnaces like the ones shown in this old photograph. In 1999, investment was close to a trough, and investment growth had been slowing ever since the austerity program was started in the second half of 1993. Today, however, we're pretty obviously closer to a peak. And after 20+% investment growth over the last 5 years, there's serious excess capacity in a wide range of sectors. To take just two of the most extreme cases, the steel sector and the property sector. In the case of the steel sector, Chinese total installed capacity has risen from something like 100 million tons at the beginning of this decade to over 600 million tons today. 600 million tons is greater than the combined capacity of the US, Japan, and South Korea. And it's interesting to note that today the Great Leap Forward dream of catching up to the US in steel production has come true to such a remarkable extent that Chinese excess steel capacity alone now exceeds total US production. In the case of office space, or Beijing office space specifically, there are now estimated to be vacancies of 100 million square feet, which would take 14 years to fill, even at the peak take-up rates of the last few years. And in residential property, it's been estimated that there are now inventories equivalent to 24 months' sales. This excess capacity is important because government-influenced investment, according to the World Bank's estimate, is only about a third of total investment. If we take this 1/3 estimate of the World Bank, that's equal to the combined shares of the real estate and export-influenced sectors. So we can see that while the government-influenced investment will certainly continue to grow strongly as a result of the stimulus program, this could easily be offset by weakness in these other two sectors. It would seem that the outlook for the export-influenced investment is clearly quite poor, given the WTO's estimate of a 9% contraction in world trade this year. And with 24 months sales of residential inventory now, it's hard to see how the outlook for real estate investment can be all that much better.